And outspeak brave Horatius, the captain of the gate. To every man upon this earth, death cometh soon or late. And how can man die better than facing fearful odds? For the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods.
So this is how I understand it. In this world, there are stories that describe the two of us. Stories about our experiences, with parts that don't even make it into the chronicles I've heard about back home. Aisling finished speaking and nibbled on a saltine cracker, wincing as the myriad flavors hit her tongue. Sebakhira nodded, then turned to Marisol, who was sitting cross-legged on the second bed, looking very emotional. "This is the truth, as you and I have discovered," Sebakhira said. Then she licked her forepaws thoughtfully. "I suppose I should introduce myself. I'm Sebakhira, teacher of the psionic traditions under the employ of Vaiparu, king of Pakunui. Or rather, I was under the king's employ until recently." Marisol furrowed her brow. "Okay, I remember the name Pakunui. You're a character in a Macaulay story. I think you might be from either Faith in Chaos or the Stormbreakers. You're definitely from one of the older stories. I honestly don't remember." Sebakhira began to pace the length of the room, making a deep growling sound as she lost herself in thought. "That woman who attacked us. I know her," Sebakhira said. "She's the Paradox," Marisol replied, pressing her thumb into her temples as she tried to jog her own memory. "You fought her in... oh, what book was it? I know it was the big battle with the planet killers." "A battle? Planet killers?" Sebakhira asked, tilting her head. Aisling looked completely lost. Marisol snapped her fingers. "The Levakian Uprising," she said. "You and Tantamile worked together in the Levakian Uprising, and that's where you fought the Paradox." Silence. Sebakhira gave no sign of recognition. Instead, the white lioness replied through bared fangs. "My people, the Levakian race, are loyal subjects of the Partogan kingdom. There is no uprising, and I should kill you where you stand for implying our princess would partake in such an action." Aisling stood up and tapped Marisol on the shoulder. "What does she mean by that?" Aisling asked. It was Marisol's turn to tilt her head. After staring at Sebakhira for a moment, she came to a conclusion. "You're from an early chapter," Marisol said. "You're from an early part of the story. What's the last thing you remember before you got pulled into this world?" Sebakhira wrapped her tail around her hind legs. She was agitated. "I was aboard the starship Shieldbreaker, having just explained the history of the Paradox to Princess Tantamile. We had received news about the death of the Partogan queen and were discussing the upcoming royal election. And then our surroundings became strange. The Paradox appeared. She was not alone. There were others with her." Sebakhira turned toward Aisling. "I heard about you from her. I knew I needed to find you at once. Does that mean you're going to help us?" Sebakhira bared her teeth in a terrifying expression that Aisling guessed to be a smile. She could not sense hostility, at least. Marisol's phone buzzed. "It's Macaulay," she gasped. He's the writer who created you. I don't really have time to explain, but he and I... we kinda knew this was possible. For fictional characters like you to appear in the real world anyway, there was an incident a couple months ago." Aisling stood up and looked around the room. "So, my world's not real," Aisling said. "I'm not real." Aisling could see a deeply uncomfortable expression on Marisol's face, and it did nothing to reassure her. "You're, More real now than you were yesterday, Marisol replied non-committally, then buried her nose in her phone. Aisling opened up the refrigerator and found a half-eaten package of croquettes. Marisol had saved them after her latest trans-Pacific flight. Aisling took a hesitant bite. A cascading explosion of flavor hit Aisling's mouth, causing her to shudder. Gasping loudly, she began to greedily scarf down the croquettes. The food in this world was full of multi-layered flavors and was very delicious. It made the food of her own world seem bland and forgettable by comparison. "Okay, I've got something," Marisol announced. "Macavity already knows what's going on. You two made the news. He says he can help you, but you have to come to him, though. He can't go to you." "Won't you show us the way? We're foreign to this world," Sebakhira asked. "We do not know how to find this writer of yours." Marisol swore. "I mean, I live on the other side of the world, and if I miss the return flight, I might get stranded here." She fiddled her skateboard, which was leaning against the bed. Then Marisol started typing a reply on her phone. "Hold on," she mumbled. "Wait a minute." Aisling did not wait a minute. She began to feast on the magnificent, delectable treats scattered around the hotel room. Marisol was stunned by just how easy it was to get permission to leave the hotel. The senior cabin crew rep grumbled softly over the phone. "You know when the reporting time is. Be responsible and show up for work clean and sober, okay?" After that, Marisol opened up her Uber app and called for a rideshare. When the car arrived, she told Sebakhira to put her hood back up. "Why must I cover my face?" Sebakhira asked. "Because there are no talking lions in this world," Marisol hissed just before shoving Sebakhira into the back seat and telling the driver in a slurred voice, "We're all kinda drunk. Can you just get us to this address in Chi-Town while we take a teensy-tiny little cat nap?" The drive from Flint to Chi-Town took about 20 minutes. The city was quickly left behind, and darkness took the car. Marisol knew that Macavity lived in a very rural part of Michigan, far away from cities and surrounded by farmland. The darkness of night was more total here than the bustling hubbub of Manila. It seemed to press against the car windows like water against a submarine. The only light came from Marisol's phone, which was being held by Sebakhira. The lioness was trying to bring herself up to speed on everything there was to know about the writer named Macavity. Chi-Town is a very small settlement of only a few dozen people, all of whom were asleep when Marisol's carpool arrived. The driver expressed some confusion when Marisol, Aisling, and Sebakhira told him he was at the correct location. "Ladies, this is a park," he said, gesturing to the nearby swing set and the distant bubbling sounds of the Shiawassee River. "We know," Marisol replied. "Our friend is going to meet us here." Marisol, Aisling, and Sebakhira were left alone in the park with only the noise of the river to keep them company in the darkness. Aisling cupped her hands together and whispered into her palm. A moment later, the clouds parted, allowing a half-moon to illuminate the scene. "Best not to draw attention to ourselves," Sebakhira whispered. "I sense we are being followed." "Well, Macavity is supposed to be here," Marisol reminded her. "He might be close by." "In that case, I shall rephrase. We are being followed by someone other than your friend," Sebakhira replied. Aisling had wandered away. She was distracted by the sounds of nature. The shallow river and the land surrounding it was full of animal nightlife. Marisol shuddered and drew her coat tighter around herself. "I've read those chapters you mentioned," Sebakhira said. "Song of the Solitaire. It seems to me that this man you call the writer, my creator, is a dishonorable person. To think our universe was created by such a careless and stupid person fills me with dread." "You're not the first person to say that," Marisol mumbled. Maybe you'll get to meet Callie while you're here. She knows this beyond the fourth wall crap better than any of us. I just got lucky enough to get dragged into the Malum incident." "What's the Malum incident?" Aisling asked. "That," a male voice spoke from the darkness, "requires a lot of explanation, and we don't have the time." A dark-skinned man, dressed in a blue coat and rectangular glasses, stepped out of the darkness. He was armed with a long object that Marisol initially mistook for a rifle. Sebakhira and Aisling both took a step back. Marisol did not. "Holy shit, Mac, is that you?" Marisol said to the figure. He lowered his weapon. "Cho," he said, "you're, a lot shorter than I expected." Marisol folded her arms. "I'm average for people in my country," she snapped. "And unless you want me to start calling you a fat American, can you help these two already? They jumped out of your books and smashed up the town next door. There's cops asking questions, and I think there's more of your characters running around out there. So this is all kind of your fault anyway." "So I've noticed," Macavity 116 replied, keeping his weapon at a low ready position. "Were you followed? Is anyone else with you?" Marisol looked around and realized that both Aisling and Sebakhira were suddenly on alert. "Am I the only one here who doesn't have superpowers?" Marisol started to ask before Aisling interrupted her. "Someone's here." Very suddenly, Aisling vanished from view. She had shapeshifted into a wolf and slipped into a nearby bush. Sebakhira lowered her hood and peered around, growling. Marisol could feel waves of intense heat rippling away from the lioness. Macavity signaled Marisol. "Over here! Stand by me!" he said. Marisol sprinted across the grass and quickly stood beside Macavity. This was the first time she had seen him in person, and under the low light it was difficult to make out any details beyond dark skin and very short hair. She did, however, get a closer look at the weapon Macavity was holding. It was not, as she first thought, a rifle. Macavity was carrying a flintlock musket. "Show yourself!" Sebakhira snarled into the darkness. There was a rustling sound, about 100 yards away from the distant side of the park. A figure stepped through the moonlight and became visible. It was a young woman. In that moment, Marisol realized that spotting any more of Macavity's characters in the real world was going to be easy. Most of them were beautiful women that would stand out in a crowd. This woman in particular, stepping out of the darkness and approaching the group, was one Marisol found very familiar. "Tenna," she breathed. "You know her?" Sebakhira asked. "Yeah," Marisol replied. "It's a long story, but I kinda helped create her. She's as much my character as she is Macavity's." "Hey, Cho, if we're about to get killed by one of our characters, you might as well use my real name," Macavity said. "Call me Blake." "Marisol," Marisol replied. Blake cocked the hammer and raised his musket. "That's close enough, Tenna," he yelled. "Stop there." Tenna Honora was a character from Song of the Solitaire. Marisol was heavily involved in Tenna's creation to such an extent that even now under the half-moonlight she could see her own handiwork. Tenna was a 16-year-old girl with out-of-control red hair and amber eyes. She had a few youthful freckles scattered about her face. Tenna wore a flowing blue dress that seemed to be made for an action movie hero. It included lightweight padded armor over the chest and shoulders, knee-length boots, and a utility belt. Marisol gulped. The last time she had seen Tenna, at least 2 characters had rebelled against the author, Macavity. But that time, Tenna was safely confined to the pages of her own book. This time around, Marisol and Blake were not so lucky. Tenna began to speak. Just like Aisling, Sebakhira, and Akira, Tenna's mouth movements did not match the words she spoke. It seemed as though her native language was being instantly translated into English in real time by an invisible force. Marisol found it very off-putting. "I just got here. Akira's holding down the fort while we set up a proper gate for my master to use," Tenna said. Tenna's face flushed at the word master, and Marisol grimaced. It was an aspect of Tenna's character that Marisol disliked and intended to erase in the sequel. Now, it looked like Marisol might not live to see that sequel. "Has Akira filled you in yet?" Tenna spoke to Sebakhira. "She said we can force the author to make whatever changes we want to our worlds. We can fix everything that's wrong before we get rid of him once and for all." "Blake, they're gonna kill you," Marisol gasped. "Yeah, kinda figured," Blake whispered. "Start backing up. My car's by the road. We're gonna make a run for it." "Don't you live in a terrible world where everyone is fighting all the time?" Tenna asked, taking a step forward. She looked as though she was pleading. "You can't possibly want to defend him when it's his fault we all live in eternal nightmares." Tenna pointed at Blake. "You might want to run," he whispered to Marisol, "before they decide they're going to kill you too." "Too late for that," Marisol replied. "Aisling already picked a fight with Akira, and I'm worried for her. Also, I'm worried for you too. You really brought that thing to a superhero fight?" She tapped the musket. "Short notice," Blake grumbled. "You try planning a war against homemade gods." Meanwhile, the confrontation between Sebakhira and Tenna was rapidly spiraling out of control. "I could never forgive that monster for what he's done." Tenna raised her voice, pointing one finger at Blake. A cluster of blue sparks shot out of her fingertip. "I might agree with you, but I will decide for myself what kind of person the author is, not you," Sebakhira replied, "and certainly not the paradox or your so-called master." Electricity popped and snapped around both Sebakhira and Tenna. Marisol grabbed Blake's arm. "Psionics!" she hissed. "Blake, they're gonna wreck this little town!" Blake lowered his rifle and shouted, "Not here! Don't fight here!" Too late.
So